Hey, welcome back, everybody. So welcome to video 1B. Remember, for section 1, kind of a longer section, so I'm splitting this one up into two different videos rather than call them video 1 and 2. Mess up with the numbering of the sections from the textbook. We'll just call them 1A and 1B. So last video we learned some of the basics about Rome, how the geography of Italy impacted its development as well as its earlier beginnings as a city-state. Now we're going to get into the first major stage of Roman history and learn about the Roman Republic, as you see on the title of the slide up here. Now the word republic comes from the Latin res publica, which roughly translates to that which belongs to the people. Now, it was not the same thing as a democracy where the people have direct rule like we talked about in Athens, but rather a government where the people have a say by choosing which officials will lead them. Let's discuss the structure of the republic's government. First, you've got the Senate. Now, during the early days, the Senate was the top power in the government, which is a bit different from our own system of government, where the Senate is powerful, but the president as the executive is the top power in our own government. There were about 300 members, so it was a good bit larger than our own Senate, and originally all members were patricians. Now, patricians, you see here, that's a key term. They were the upper class. They owned most of the land, and they had the most influence. One other difference between the Roman Senate and our own is that once appointed, a Roman senator serves for life. You are never getting rid of them. U.S. senators can run for election as many times as they want, but they serve 6-year terms, after which they must win an election. Roman senators never had to run for election. So while the Senate was the top power, it wasn't the only power. There was also the consuls. Now, consuls also came from the patrician class, and their job was to be the government executive. Let me move me out of the way here so you can see these guys a little better. There we go. So as the government executives, there we go, that meant that they ran the government and the armies. So it was somewhat similar to what our own president does. Our president is the chief executive of our government, and he's also commander-in-chief of the military. So the consuls served a very, very similar function. However, there were some very significant checks on their power. The whole system of checks and balances that we have in our own government, it didn't exist to the same extent in Rome, but they did have some. They were very fearful of these guys becoming a monarch. One thing that you see right there from the picture of them is that there were 2 of them. You didn't have only one. This was meant so that no one consul would ever get too powerful, declare himself king or anything like that. It limited how powerful any single consul could become. There were times, though, when the Romans willingly gave total power to rulers, and these guys were known as dictators. Now, dictators were chosen during times of war. Democracy and checks and balance were thrown out in favor of having one person make all of the decisions when you're involved in war. However, once the fighting was over, dictators were expected to give up their power. An example of that is this guy here, Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus, you see here talking to the 2 consuls here on the right. He was a famous Roman general, and he had retired and was living a simple life as a farmer. And when Rome was being attacked, the consuls went to him and said, hey, we need you to come back. We'll give you all the power, all the decision making. He wins their battles, and afterwards, what does he do? He voluntarily, willingly steps down and goes back to a simple life as a farmer. And so this really kind of became the standard by which other leaders were expected to follow. All right, so we've discussed how the Roman government has been controlled pretty much entirely by the patricians or the upper class up to this point. Eventually, other social classes began to fight for their rights. And besides the patricians, the other main social class you see here in the title slide were the plebeians. Now, the plebeians, or plebs as they were called, they were your lower or middle classes. They weren't just the very poor. They were more your working classes. They were farmers. They were merchants. They were artisans, people like that. And they originally had very little influence in the government. Eventually, after a good bit of struggle, they gained more political rights, such as the ability to elect these guys called tribunes. Now, tribunes were officials elected by the plebs to have someone speak for their interest in the government, and so that way it wasn't all going to be about the patricians. Another political power was that they could veto laws. To veto means to block laws. So laws that blatantly favored the upper class could now be blocked by tribunes. Another breakthrough for the plebs came with the formation of this thing called the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables were written codes of Roman law, right? And they were publicly posted. You see, this is the posting of the 12 tables, so everyone could go and refer to them in public. Remember how when we first learned about Hammurabi's Code, we discussed why writing laws down was so important? One of the reasons why it's so important is that it protects people from government abuse. Now that Roman laws were written down, it made them the same for all social classes. So for the first time, a plebeian could dispute a ruling from a patrician judge because they had access to the actual laws. So now we've covered a good bit on Roman government, let's take a look at Roman society. Like in all classical civilizations, the family was the basic unit of Roman society. And also, like in all classical civilizations, families and societies in general were patriarchal. Now, in Rome, this was known as pater familias. Right? Pater is Latin for father, and then familias, you've got, refers to the family. The father was the absolute head of the Roman family, and this was protected by Roman law. He literally had the power of life and death over his wife and children, and he demanded total respect. That being said, Roman women did have significant improvement of rights. They had a good bit more rights than Greek women. They could own property and businesses, although the majority of them did stay home and, do your traditionally womanly things of tending to the house and the kids. Upper class women, though, in particularly, gained more freedoms as the Roman Republic progressed. They could attend theaters, they could dine out, they had significant influence in social circles. Right? So aside from running the house and being in charge of all the servants and so forth, they could lead a life outside the house, which was something that was denied to Greek women, even of the upper class. Now, education. Education was a priority for Romans. And this, again, showed, kind of an equal access for both boys and girls. Here you have an old Roman sculpture of a girl reading. That was something that was not encouraged in a lot of the societies we've talked about so far. So all of the social classes, right? So it wasn't just for boys and girls, but all of the social classes were trained in literacy. Literacy is the ability to read and write. If you were literate, it means that you can read or write. Now, education beyond basic literacy was still mostly for the upper class, and they often hired Greek tutors to teach their children. Roman religion was kind of interesting, and that was very unoriginal. It was basically a copy of the Greek religion. They kept the gods pretty much the same. They just gave them different names. So here's Zeus, right? King of the gods in Greece. He becomes Jupiter. You've got Athena. We talked about her, the patron goddess of Athens. She becomes Minerva. Aphrodite becomes Venus, whereas Ares, the god of war, becomes Mars, and so forth. All right, so you see that they really weren't into the idea of creating their own gods. They said, we like what the Greeks have. We'll just give them more Roman names. The Romans celebrated a bunch of feasts and festivals dedicated to all of these gods. This helped create a strong sense of community among the Romans. It was a very important part of their social calendar. Now, the last thing to discuss in this video is how Rome expands. Now, as the city of Rome grew, so too did its influence in the Italian peninsula. By the year 270 BCE, Rome controlled pretty much all of Italy. Right, so we see the darker shaded area is Roman territory, people given Roman citizenship. Here's Rome itself. And then the lighter orange is allied areas, people not given citizenship, but still under their control. So by 270, all of the Italian peninsula is under Roman control. And they did this with a very effective army. The Roman army was extremely well trained and disciplined. The legion was the basic military unit. And this could be very, very large. It could consist of upwards of 5,000 men. Move me out of the way. There we go. You see how the organization that was involved with it, right? It was broken into cohorts, and each cohort had its own commander, and it was ranked in seniority and so forth. Right? This was not just a mass mob that they told to charge. They fought in unison. There was order to them. You see in this picture up here, you've got the archers in the back. You've got the phalanx formation with the shields up in the front. They were highly trained, highly effective, and it was also predominantly made up of citizen soldiers. Like in Greece, the Romans believed that citizens made the best soldiers because they had an emotional investment in fighting for Rome. They valued loyalty and service to Rome rather than just fighting for a paycheck. Now, overall, the lands that were conquered by the Romans were treated fairly. Conquered people had to acknowledge Roman authority. but they were allowed to keep their own customs and traditions. So this was very similar to what we talked about with the Persians. Some conquered people were even given citizenship status. So they were treated fairly, and so we get the idea there. All right, so that wraps things up with talking about the early days of Rome and the Roman Republic. And in the next video, we're going to get into how we shift from a republic into a Roman Empire.